Have you ever stood in front of an ornate gate, holding an invitation with your name clearly printed on it only to be stopped, as if you didn't even exist? Naomi Carter knows that feeling better than anyone. A successful black CEO, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, she walked up to Crescent Oaks, an exclusive club reserved only for those who belong. But when Naomi presented her invitation, the receptionist gave her a cold, polite smile. "I'm sorry, this is a members-only area. Please leave." Nearby, members glanced her way, as if her very presence was out of place. One even whispered, loud enough for her to hear. There must be some mistake. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a message. You don't belong here. And Naomi swallowed her anger the same way she had swallowed it 1,000 times before. Every time, someone reminded her of her skin color, her background, or the limits they thought she should never cross. But if every closed gate is a slap in the face, this time Naomi didn't turn away in humiliation. She took a deep breath, and she smiled. Because the greatest dream of those who've been pushed out isn't to keep knocking forever. It's to become the one holding the keys. If you've ever stood before a closed gate because of your race or your status, share this story so others can witness the power of flipping the script. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because this is just one of many stories you'll want to hear all the way to the end. Naomi turned and walked away. But 1 hour later, the very place that humiliated her would be forced to open its gates and bow in welcome. This is how she turned shame into strength and rewrote the rules of those who thought they held all the power. Naomi Carter pulled up to the gates of Crescent Oaks on a strangely quiet morning. The sky was clear. Old oak trees stretched their shadows across the stone-paved drive, and the gold-plated sign, Crescent Oaks Country Club, glimmered in the sunlight, flaunting the pride of generations who had kept this place as their own. It wasn't just a name. To Naomi, it had once been a distant dream, a symbol of power she only saw through the window of a worn-out city bus, riding with her mother, who worked as a maid for the wealthy families inside. This gate had always been the line between two worlds, one where she stood and one she was never meant to touch. But now, Naomi wasn't that little black girl staring from the outside anymore. She rolled down her window, took a deep breath, and savored the moment. The sleek black sedan she drove, the perfectly tailored suit hugging her frame, the engraved invitation in her hand, proof of how far she had come to be here. Still, as she neared the 10-foot wrought-iron gates, something in the air made her shiver. Gates are supposed to welcome you, but these gates, with their ornate scrollwork and cold steel shine, felt like they weren't inviting anyone in. They were deciding who got to belong, and who didn't. Naomi stopped at the guard booth. A middle-aged man in uniform stepped out. His eyes swept over her, her face, her skin, before lingering on the invitation. He looked longer than necessary, his polite smile sharp and empty. "Good morning. This is a members-only area," he said, his tone flat, like he was reading from a script. Naomi held out her invitation. "I've been invited to a meeting this morning." He took the envelope but didn't bother to change his expression. "Yes, but this is a private club. All members and guests must be cleared by the board. I don't see your name on the list." Naomi could feel the stares from the golfers in the distance. They had paused their conversations to glance at her, measuring her from afar. It was a look she knew too well, not curious, not kind, but calculating. Does she deserve to be here? Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, but her voice stayed calm. "I believe there's been a mistake. This invitation is directly from the chairman." The man shrugged, keeping his polite smile perfectly in place. "I'll need to call for confirmation, but it's a busy morning. You'll need to wait outside." Naomi glanced up at the gate. It was just a gate. Yet, in that moment, it felt like it was speaking to her. "You don't belong here." She sat still for a beat, inhaled deeply, and smiled. Not because she was amused, but because she knew this wasn't going to be a game they would win so easily. What the guard didn't know was this. Naomi had never come to any place just to wait for the gate to open. She came to do something else. And in 1 hour, this place would open its gates to her, whether it wanted to or not. Naomi stepped out of her car. Her low heels clicked against the stone driveway, small, precise sounds that somehow carried farther than she expected. Heads turned. Those standing near the clubhouse entrance stopped mid-conversation, their eyes fixed on her, casual but probing. A blonde woman in a crisp white golf dress raised her brows and leaned toward her friend, whispering just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Wrong place, sweetheart." Soft, tidy laughter followed, clean as the slice of a knife. Naomi didn't need to turn around to know those eyes were scanning every detail. Her suit, her posture, her skin. And in their minds, the verdict had already been made. A man in uniform, a manager, by the look of him, walked out from the clubhouse, backing up the guard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is a private area, members only." Polite words, but the tone was clear. "You don't belong." Naomi held up the invitation again, her calmness unsettling them. "I've been invited to a meeting with the chairman. This is signed by him." The manager glanced at the envelope, then handed it back with a stiff smile. "There must be some mistake. You're not on the list." He said it slowly, each word measured, as if formality could hide what was really happening. An unspoken decision that she would not pass through that gate. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, long enough to make the manager shift uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Then she locked eyes with him and smiled. A small, sharp smile. "Perhaps," she said lightly, "you should double-check. I didn't come here to find a new place to play golf." Her confidence caught him off guard. He turned away, muttering to the guard, but Naomi heard him clearly. "Just leave her waiting." Naomi looked up at the polished brass sign above the gate. For years, this place had been a fortress of exclusion, a monument to a kind of power designed to keep people like her out. And the irony? In this moment, she realized she didn't need their permission to walk through that gate. Because once you understand the rules of the game, you can rewrite them. And Naomi was about to teach them that lesson in a way they'd never forget. She held out the invitation again, this time like presenting evidence in a trial she knew she'd already won. Her name embossed, the chairman's signature clear, the gold Crescent Oaks seal shining in the morning light. But the manager didn't bother to study any of it. He skimmed it and handed it back with the same quick, dismissive gesture, as if the paper carried no value at all. "I'm sorry," he repeated, voice steady but hollow. "Rules are rules." Naomi knew better. This wasn't about rules. It was ritual, the ritual of protecting a circle that believed she would never belong. She took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping her voice measured. She wasn't that 12-year-old girl standing outside the fence of the private school, listening to the laughter of children she could never join. She was Naomi Carter, CEO of a multinational company. But titles and invitations, didn't matter here. Power, she realized, lived in the mouths of people who could use a single rule to erase her existence, as if she'd never even been invited at all. For a moment, she wanted to say it all, that she'd been personally invited. That she contributed more to the local economy than most members here. That with one phone call, the chairman would come out and greet her himself. But she didn't. Because she knew any defense would only confirm their belief that she needed to prove she belonged. And she was done playing that game. Naomi stepped back, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. "I see," she said softly, her words cutting just enough to make the manager finally meet her gaze. Rules do have a way of choosing who they apply to. For a split second, the air kite. But he turned away, pretending her words weren't worth acknowledging. Naomi said nothing more. She turned, walked back to her car. Each step pressed the humiliation deeper into her chest. But alongside it, something else began to grow. Not rage. A plan. Sliding into the driver's seat, Naomi glanced once more at the gate. It still stood there, tall and unyielding, like a silent declaration. You don't belong here. She smiled again. Not because she was amused, but because she had just realized something important. If they thought she was on the outside of that gate, they had no idea who really controlled the game. In 1 hour, this place would learn how to say welcome, and they would say it to her. Naomi drove away from the gates of Crescent Oaks, but the chill lingered. Not the chill of winter. The cold of a world that had shut its doors. Every detail of that morning replayed in her head. The shuffling steps of the manager coming down the stairs, his polite smile, the whispers of those women on the clubhouse porch, all of it like a broken record from her childhood. Her mind drifted back. She remembered the first time she followed her mother into a fine restaurant, not to dine, but to clear tables. Naomi was 10, hiding in the kitchen, peering out at the dining room where white children her age laughed under the warm golden lights. Out there was the world of clinking glasses and silverware, the music of a different class. In the kitchen stood Naomi, in a faded hand-me-down shirt, her stomach growling, too afraid to even step close. That feeling of being stopped at the edges of someone else's world never really left her. Crescent Oaks that morning? Just a polished, more sophisticated version of that kitchen, a place where she was still on the other side of the door and the people inside still believed she didn't belong. Naomi gripped the steering wheel, pressing her forehead to it for a moment. Anger surged, a wave that wanted to crash through everything in its path. But she didn't let it. She had learned long ago, for people like her, explosions only proved them right. So she stayed silent. The same silence that once kept her mother safe from the daily humiliations of her job, the kind of silence sharp as a blade, not cowardice, but preparation for the strike that would come later. Naomi let out a thin, almost invisible smile. Not the smile of someone defeated. The smile of someone already planning her next move. They thought she'd leave Crescent Oaks humiliated. She wasn't leaving in defeat. She was leaving to prepare her return. She adjusted the rearview mirror and stared into her own eyes. "All right then," she whispered, her voice light as air but steady as stone. "If they want to play power games, I'll show them what real power looks like." The gates of Crescent Oaks loomed behind her like a shield of arrogance. But Naomi knew every wall had a crack. And she, more than anyone, knew how to find them. When she came back, no one would dare tell her to stand outside the gate again. She hadn't even left when the clubhouse doors opened. The manager, the same man who'd dismissed her invitation, walked down the steps like he owned the ground beneath him. He took his time, each step deliberate. The kind of walk people use when they're so used to holding power they've forgotten what it feels like to hurry for anyone. "Ms. Carter, is it?" His voice was calm, cold, her name sounding like something he'd just read off a list. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but there are standards here that no one can overlook." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Standards?" He nodded, smiling, but only with his lips. "Crescent Oaks has long-standing principles. We value privacy and selectivity. This isn't personal. We simply have to protect the character of the club." Naomi let him speak, didn't interrupt. She knew his type. The ones who wrap their prejudice in velvet words. They'd never say you don't belong here. They'd say standards, tradition, character. Beautiful words, masking their fear of losing privilege. Naomi gave him a small smile, one he might mistake for acceptance. "I appreciate your desire to protect your traditions," she said, her tone light, steady. "But I was invited, and unless I'm mistaken, the chairman himself signed that invitation." The manager tilted his head slightly, measuring her words. "I understand, but he's a very busy man. Surely you know, sometimes invitations are mistakes made by assistants." There it was. A clean little dagger, hidden in silk. Naomi felt every word, its real message etched deep, People like you only end up here by accident." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she held his gaze, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, then smiled. "Perhaps you're right," she said softly. "Mistakes do happen, especially when people are quick to judge others." His expression stiffened. He turned away, muttering something about following up when we have confirmation. Naomi didn't stick around for more empty words. She turned, walked back to her car, and for the first time that morning, felt lighter. Because if this was the game they wanted to play, she already knew her next move. And the next time she came back, she wouldn't need an invitation. She'd return as someone they'd have no choice but to welcome. Naomi stood beside her car, letting her silence fill the wide, manicured courtyard. The manager disappeared inside. The guard returned to his booth. The members went back to their conversations, acting like she had never been there. This was how their world erased people. No name, no confrontation, just pretending you didn't exist until you disappeared. But Naomi wasn't disappearing. She touched the invitation again, its sharp folds still crisp, its thick paper heavy in her hand, the golden seal shining like a cruel joke. Everything about it said she had the right to be there. But all it took was one word, rules, to turn it into nothing. Naomi smiled. Not for them. For herself. A thin, cutting smile, the same one she'd worn every time she'd stood at the edge of the line between allowed and forbidden. And every time that smile didn't end the story. It started a new chapter. Her thoughts snapped together like puzzle pieces. Her network of investments. The stakes her company held in real estate and asset management. The private meetings where powerful men thought they were speaking in confidence while Naomi quietly memorized every name and connection. She knew Crescent Oaks wasn't some untouchable island. It had a parent company, a board of directors, and cracks in its armor of tradition waiting to be pried open. She opened her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Names appeared like chess pieces: legal counsel, investment partners, shareholders in the parent company of Crescent Oaks. Naomi inhaled deeply. You don't break down doors when you can buy the keys. Most people would drive home, rant about the humiliation, and move on. Naomi Carter wasn't most people. Being excluded from Crescent Oaks didn't make her retreat. It gave her a reason to make sure no one could ever exclude her again. She started the engine. The sky was bright and clear, but Naomi saw a battle ahead, one that wouldn't be fought on the golf course or at a reception desk. It would be fought in boardrooms, in contracts, in handshakes no one expected. As the car rolled forward, she whispered to herself, "All right, they want to play by the old rules, but this game's about to get new ones." And when those new rules were written, the very people who shut her out this morning would be the ones opening the gate and bowing as they welcomed her in. Naomi shut her car door, sealing out every trace of noise behind her. No more polite venom from the manager, no more mocking laughter from the women on the porch. Just her, the sound of her own heartbeat, and the kind of silence so deep she could hear her breathing. She placed the invitation on the passenger seat. How ridiculous a single sheet of paper could give her permission to walk through a gate, yet held no weight against a simple shake of the head. Naomi stared at it for a long moment, then reached for her phone. Her fingers scrolled through her contacts like she was scanning a battlefield map. This wasn't personal anymore. This was a power play, and Naomi had been in the game long enough to know exactly how to win. She dialed. On the other end, the deep, even voice of Garrison, her longtime legal counsel, the man who'd helped her push through deals traditionalists tried to keep her out of. "Naomi, what's going on?" "Crescent Oaks," she said, clipped and sharp. "I want anything that gives me leverage there, equity, voting rights, licenses, whatever makes it impossible for them to ever block me at that gate again. And I want it today." There was a beat of silence. Garrison knew Naomi. When she said today, she didn't mean a long-term plan. She meant a blitz swift, bold, and absolute. Understood, he said. I'll pull their ownership structure. Are they independent or part of a larger group? Naomi smirked. We both know nothing is ever truly independent. Find out who owns them. She hung up before he could ask more. The next call was to Elena, her real estate and distressed assets partner, the woman who specialized in buying the kind of traditional properties that were drowning in quiet debt. Elena, Naomi said before the other woman could even greet her, Crescent Oaks. I want to know who holds their debt, who holds their shares, and if there's a crack to seize control, I want my hand in it before they even realize what's happening. Elena laughed, slow and knowing. Another exclusive little boys' club. Fine, I'll call you back in an hour. Naomi set the phone down and closed her eyes for a moment. She could still see their faces at the gate appraising, dismissive, certain she didn't belong. Those looks were fuel. There was nothing more satisfying than using their own power to shatter their rules. And Naomi knew once you figure out who really owns the gate, you don't beg for entry. You buy the keys. Or, better yet, buy the entire gate. Her phone buzzed just 15 minutes later. Elena never wasted time when Naomi used her emergency voice. You're going to love this, Elena began, her tone laced with intrigue. Crescent Oaks doesn't stand alone. They're owned by a parent company, Ashbourne Holdings. And... Naomi sat up straighter. Go on. And Ashbourne is one of the funds your company invested in 2 years ago. Indirectly, you still hold shares. Naomi, not much but enough to open a door, enough to get a seat at the table. Naomi let out a dry, sharp laughy. The gate that had slammed in her face now revealed another entrance, one the Crescent Oaks crowd probably didn't even know existed. Life has a funny sense of humor, Naomi said. They locked me out, not realizing I've been holding a key this whole time. Elena chuckled. So, what's the next move? You want to increase your stake? I can start reaching out to a few big shareholders. Naomi stared out the window, the midday sun stretching long shadows across the oak-lined road leading back to the club. I don't just want access, she said slowly. I want a seat at the table where they decide who gets through that gate. Find me anyone on Ashbourne's board willing to sell their voting rights. And do it fast. Elena paused just long enough for Naomi to know she understood. On it. I'll start making calls. Naomi leaned back, the picture in her mind coming into focus. Crescent Oaks, the pretentious facade. Ashbourne, the real power. And her sitting across from men who still thought she was just a passing investor. Unaware, she had never truly left the table. In that moment, the sting of humiliation from the gate hardened into resolve. She wasn't the excluded one anymore. She was the woman about to rewrite the rules of who gets to belong. She scrolled through old names in her contacts, people who'd take her call, who'd rethink their positions at the table after one conversation with her. Naomi knew this game wouldn't be won on golf courses or at cocktail parties. It would be won in cold boardrooms, where rules were written in contracts and cemented with signatures. A text from Elena popped up. Got someone. Meeting in 45 minutes? Naomi smiled. She had once stood outside the fence, looking in. Now she would decide who stood inside. And this time, the ones who blocked her would be the ones asking permission to enter. Her phone rang before she could leave the parking lot. Elena, again, faster than expected. You're going to like this one even more, Elena said, her voice stretching out the suspense. The shareholder I just spoke to, the one ready to talk, is the very person who sent you that invitation to Crescent Oaks. His name's Charles Whitmore. Naomi frowned. The name was dusty, but familiar. Charles Whitmore. Old Charles from Ashbourne. That's him. I just spoke to his assistant, Naomi. Elena's voice dropped. He planned this. He wanted you to see exactly how they'd treat you. Naomi leaned back in her seat, a short, dry laugh escaping. Old Charles, the man everyone dismissed as outdated, quietly pushed aside by the younger, louder members of the board. Turns out he wasn't out of touch. He was baiting a trap, waiting for someone like her to break the circle tightening around his neck. He's playing a game, Naomi muttered, almost to herself. More like he's inviting you to reset the board, Elena replied. Naomi, he knew you wouldn't walk away, and he needs someone who isn't afraid to blow it all up. Naomi stared straight ahead, eyes sharpening. Suddenly, the humiliation at the gate wasn't personal anymore. It was the spark exactly as Charles intended. He'd thrown her into the pit of their contempt, only to offer her the ladder he'd been building in secret. Set up a meeting, Naomi said, switching to speakerphone, one hand braced on the wheel. Tonight, and Elena. Yes? Make sure he knows I'm not coming to negotiate for a seat. She paused, letting the weight of her words land. I'm coming to flip the entire table. Elena chuckled a low, incredulous laugh. Got it. Naomi hung up, leaning back in her seat. The pieces were sliding into place. An arrogant country club, an untouchable parent company, and an old man, underestimated and exiled, waiting for his last chance to prove his worth. Now, Naomi was the piece Charles had just moved into play. She closed her eyes for a moment. Maybe what happened that morning wasn't an accident. Maybe it was an invitation to a much bigger game. And Naomi Carter. She never played from the sidelines. Just 1 hour after being turned away at the gates of Crescent Oaks, Naomi sat in a high-rise office, staring at her laptop screen with eyes like blades. Confirmation messages rolled in one after another. Acquired 4% equity from Fund B. Voting rights transferred from shareholder C. Proxy approved for emergency Ashbourne board meeting. She picked up her phone, her voice crisp and cutting. Is it done? On the other end, Garrison replied, you now hold enough voting rights to attend the meeting. They can't keep you out, at least not legally. The emergency session starts in 2 hours. I'll prepare the documents. Naomi let out a quiet laugh, not one of amusement, but the spark of a match in the dark. An hour ago, she'd been brushed off at the gates like an uninvited guest. Now, she was a shareholder with the legal right to sit at the very table where the people who created those standards would have to face her. She stood, straightened her suit. That same outfit that had made her a target of judgment at Crescent Oaks this morning, now it was her armor. Naomi walked to the window, looking down at the city sprawled beneath her. How ironic. People always thought power lived behind big gates and on polished nameplates. But real power was here in cold boardrooms, where a few signatures could decide who got to walk through those gates. Her phone buzzed, a message from Elena. Charles agreed to meet you before the session. He wants to strategize. Naomi smirked. Old Charles had been playing this game longer than she thought. Maybe he'd known exactly what would happen at Crescent Oaks this morning. Maybe he wanted her to feel that sting of humiliation so that when she walked into that boardroom, she wouldn't just speak as an investor. She'd speak as someone with a debt to settle. Naomi drew in a deep breath. The shame from this morning had become fuel, and she wouldn't waste a single drop. She shot a quick message to Garrison. Prep everything. I'm not going there just to listen. Then she returned to her desk, scrolling through the board member list on her laptop. Every name was a piece on the board. And she'd learned how to play this game from the best by making her opponents believe they controlled the match, until they realized the table had already been flipped. 2 hours. And Naomi wouldn't walk into that boardroom as just a shareholder. She'd walk in as a storm. The Ashbourne boardroom felt like a cathedral. A long, gleaming wooden table stretched across the room. Old oil portraits on the wall seemed to glare at anyone who dared to challenge tradition. When Naomi entered, Every head turned toward her, none of them welcoming. At the head of the table, a man in a gray suit with slicked-back silver hair slammed his pen onto the table. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that had been obeyed for decades. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but we cannot allow a minority shareholder to come in here and jeopardize what we've built. Crescent Oaks is for those who understand its value." Naomi pulled out a chair and sat, deliberately slow, as if she controlled the tempo of the entire meeting. "Value," she repeated, her lips curling into a thin smile. "That's interesting. Tell me, is that value keeping people outside your gates and telling them they don't belong, or is it clinging to a country club that's been frozen in the last century?" Across the table, a woman leaned forward, her face flushed. "You're trying to use this as some tool to feed your ego. We've maintained these standards for decades not to open the doors to anyone who happens to have money." Naomi turned to her gaze sharp as a blade. "Oh, so it's not about the money, or is it only about the money when the person holding it doesn't look like you?" The air tightened. A few members cleared their throats. Others exchanged uneasy glances. She'd said the quiet part out loud. A gravelly voice rose from the end of the table. "Charles." "That's enough," he said, his tone slow but heavy. "Ms. Carter has every right to be here, and perhaps it's time we heard what she has to say." Some murmured their disagreement, but no one openly challenged Charles. Naomi nodded at him a small, silent acknowledgement that the board was moving exactly where she wanted. She turned back to the table, resting both hands on the cold surface. "Don't worry," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "I'm not here to destroy your traditions. I'm here to remind you that traditions mean nothing if they only exist to serve a select few while shutting out the rest of the world." No one answered. And in that silence, Naomi knew she'd pried open a door they couldn't easily close. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. Naomi leaned back, a single, deliberate motion that made the entire room feel smaller, like it now belonged to her. Her eyes swept over their faces, tense, defensive, and a little afraid. "Fascinating," she began, her voice light but cutting through the room. "You talk about tradition and value, but, if I'm not mistaken, Ashbourne recently sold off 2 historic properties to a developer just to patch over debt someone here let pile up." A few faces flinched. Naomi didn't miss a beat. "Is that the value you're protecting? Or is this just a game of keeping the shell while selling off the soul?" The man in the gray suit pounded his fist against the table. "You have no right." "Right," Naomi cut in, her smile razor thin. "If I had no right, why am I sitting here? Why do I hold voting power over the decisions you're all too nervous to make yourselves?" The tension in the room thickened. Naomi turned her focus back to the flushed woman. "You accused me of wanting to use Crescent Oaks to feed my ego. Interesting. You didn't object when this board agreed to cut the preservation budget to boost quarterly profits. Did you, what do we call that, protecting tradition or protecting your bottom line?" The woman froze, her words caught in her throat. Naomi let the silence stretch, the kind of silence that makes the truth louder than any speech. Then she turned to Charles. "Maybe I am an outsider, but sometimes it takes an outsider to see the cracks that those inside are too comfortable to acknowledge." Charles nodded, his weathered eyes glinting with agreement. "Ms. Carter is right," he said, his slow voice carrying weight. "We've been hiding behind a polished facade to avoid admitting the truth. Ashbourne is losing its soul." A few members muttered weak objections, but Naomi didn't care. She knew that in rooms like this, words weren't just spoken, they were recorded, and once recorded, they couldn't be erased. She folded her arms, delivering her closing line like a hammer. "If you truly want to protect tradition, remember this tradition has never belonged to one race or one class. It only survives when it's strong enough to open its doors to those willing to walk through. No one responded. And in that silence, Naomi knew she'd just shaken the very walls they'd built to keep her out. But this was only the beginning. And Naomi still had a card no one saw coming. Naomi had barely stepped out of the boardroom when her phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from Garrison. Have you seen the news? This story is spreading fast. Do not respond. Not yet. She opened a breaking article on a major news site. The headline screamed, "Insider source Naomi Carter wants to turn Crescent Oaks into a commercial resort. Members fear the club will lose its identity." Beneath it, an anonymous board member was quoted, "She doesn't understand the true value of this place. To Carter, it's all about profit." Naomi let out a short laugh, sharp, humorless. The cards were finally being dealt. Within hours, media and members were in an uproar. A local news channel aired an interview with a longtime member couple. The woman, blonde with a quivering voice, told the camera, "We're afraid this place will lose its soul. This isn't some commercial project. This is our home." Naomi watched the footage, recognizing the familiar stench of an old tactic smear first, isolate later. She called Garrison. "Who did this?" "Clearly, a board member," he replied. "They're rallying members against you, pushing you to back off. My money's on Bennett. He's always been against you." Naomi leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. Bennett, the silver-haired man with the preacher's voice about tradition. She remembered his look in the boardroom, disdain wrapped in suspicion. He didn't need to win inside the boardroom. He just needed to make Naomi the public enemy outside of it. She opened her laptop. Social media was flooded. "Don't let Carter ruin this place. This isn't for people who only care about money. She should be banned from coming back." Naomi took a deep breath. The irony was delicious. Just hours ago, these people didn't know or pretended not to know who she was. Now they'd turned her into the face of everything they feared. What they didn't understand was that Naomi had lived her whole life as that threat. She'd been cast as the destroyer of their order before, and she knew how to turn their fear into her leverage. She called Elena. "Set up a meeting with some of the influential members," Naomi said flatly. "I don't need them to like me. I just need them to hear the story from me before Bennett finishes writing his script." Naomi hung up. If Bennett thought a few headlines could box her in, he'd forgotten one thing. Naomi Carter didn't play to be liked. She played to win. By the next morning, Naomi woke up to a storm. The headlines dominated every feed. Television segments looped her image, a cropped photo from an old charity gala under bold captions. Naomi Carter. The Outsider. Threat to Crescent Oaks. Tradition. A local station even aired a special panel featuring longtime members. One middle-aged man, voice booming like he was defending a national monument, declared Crescent Oaks isn't just a club, it's a symbol. And people like Ms. Carter don't understand that. They just want to turn it into a money-making project. A woman chimed in, "We're not against change. But change can't come from an outsider who walks in and tells us how to live." Naomi watched, her face expressionless. But inside, she felt it the way they'd expertly cast her as the embodiment of everything they hated: an outsider, a destroyer, someone who couldn't possibly understand their values. By noon, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists clawed for comments. One even left a voicemail, "Ms. Carter. Do you have a response to being called a threat to Crescent Oaks?" Naomi leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She thought she'd grown numb to being labeled. But something about the way they said outsider dragged her back to childhood, standing at the entrance of an upscale restaurant, being told by staff, "This isn't for you, sweetie." They'd only changed the language. The message was the same: you don't belong here. Her phone lit up again. Garrison. "You need to go public, Naomi. If you don't, they'll own the narrative. And trust me, they're very good at this." Naomi paused for a moment, then replied, Good, let them talk. I want to hear exactly what they think. Naomi. Garrison, she cut in, her tone like ice. I'm not here to beg for their acceptance. I'm here to make them realize I don't need their acceptance to take control. She ended the call and stood. Criticism could break some people, but for Naomi, it was just fuel. And while they were busy throwing stones, she was already laying bricks to build a wall on her terms. Naomi disappeared from cameras. No press conferences, no statements, no public rebuttals. Reporters camped out, waiting for her to break her silence, but her phone only responded with an auto-reply, "I'm unavailable. I'll respond when necessary." To the public, Naomi might have looked cornered. In reality, she was sitting in her high-rise apartment, sipping hot tea by the window, combing through Ashbourne Holdings' financial reports. Calm on the surface, but beneath currents twisting with purpose. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Naomi knew the one who responds immediately is the one dancing to the enemy's rhythm. She didn't play by their tempo. Elena called. Naomi, people are asking why you're silent. They think you've conceded. Naomi took a slow sip of tea. Good, she said evenly. Let them think that. Let Bennett and his allies feel confident they've boxed me in. That's when they get sloppy. Elena chuckled softly. I'm starting to feel sorry for them. Naomi set her cup down, gazing out at the city. That humiliation at Crescent Oaks had transformed into a sharper weapon, patience. Silence made opponents restless. It made them believe they held control right up until they realized the table had already been rearranged. While Bennett did his interviews and rallied members against her, Naomi worked quietly calling disillusioned shareholders, reaching out to members who felt abandoned by the very board they trusted. No debates on television. Just private dinners, quiet phone calls, small, closed-door meetings the press would never hear about. Silence, not to retreat. Silence, to build an army. That night, Naomi received a message from Charles. They're weakening themselves. When you're ready, we strike. She smiled faintly. They had no idea those interviews, those smear campaigns were doing her a favor. They made the once neutral start to question if they have to smear her this desperately. What are they so afraid of? Naomi closed the folder in front of her. This game wasn't about earning favor. It was about power. And real power didn't need to shout. Bennett might think her silence meant fear. But very soon, he'd learn the truth. Silence meant a storm was coming. Naomi arrived at a small diner tucked away on a quiet street in the late afternoon. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to meet one of Ashbourne Holdings' longtime shareholders, which was exactly why Naomi knew Charles Whitmore had chosen it deliberately. No glass walls or polished boardroom tables here, just 4 small booths by the windows and an old, scratched-up counter that looked like it had been standing since the last century. Charles was already there, sitting tall despite his thin frame, his silver-white hair combed neatly, his long hands resting on the table as if holding down the weight of heavy memories. He looked up when Naomi walked in, his expression flickering with a trace of satisfaction like he had been waiting for this moment far too long. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low and gravelly but firm, "have a seat." Naomi slid into the booth, not in a rush to start. They sat in silence for a few seconds, the only sound the faint clatter of cutlery at another table. Finally, Charles took a sip of coffee and spoke. "I've been waiting for someone brave enough to break this damned spell." Naomi tilted her head. "A spell? That shell of tradition they've wrapped around Ashbourne and Crescent Oaks," he said with a thin, sardonic smile. "They call it values, but really, it's a noose to choke anyone who dares to bring change and a shield to protect their privilege. I've stomached this charade for too long." Naomi studied him. Realizing this wasn't just a strategy session, Charles didn't just want an ally. He wanted someone bold enough to shatter the chessboard he'd been forced to play on for years. "So you sent me that invitation," Naomi said quietly, "to make sure I got my warm welcome at the gate." Charles gave a small nod. "I needed you to see them for who they really are. You can't change something you haven't experienced at its ugliest." Naomi gave a small, humorless laugh, calculated. "Not calculated," Charles corrected, his eyes steady with a mix of candor and bitterness. "Patient. I knew that sooner or later, someone like you would show up, and when you did, I knew it was time to bring down that wall." Naomi leaned back, arms crossed. The pieces began to fit. Charles wasn't just some sidelined shareholder. He was an old lion, sharpening his teeth for his final hunt, and he saw in her the opportunity to take the kill shot. But Naomi also understood old lions might clear the path, but queens make the move, and the next move was going to shake the board. Charles set his cup down with a soft clink, breaking the stillness. "I watched you in that boardroom," he said, his voice even but heavy with meaning. "You didn't flinch. You didn't grovel. That's what they fear most, and that's how I know I can work with you." Naomi leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on his. "What do you want from me?" "Charles, be direct." He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh from a man who'd seen too many backroom deals but still had enough self-respect to keep things honest. "My honorary seat on Ashbourne's board. They stripped it from me when I opposed their decisions that gutted the company's legacy. I want it back, not to sit there as a relic, but to make damn sure my voice is heard when they decide its future." Naomi nodded. She wasn't surprised. This wasn't a plea from a powerless man. It was a handshake between two people with aligned interests but different weapons. Charles wanted recognition restored. Naomi wanted to rewrite the rules, and neither could do it alone. "You'll back me?" Naomi asked. "Not just back you." Charles leaned in, his sharp eyes glowing with the kind of resolve that only comes from having lost and survived. "I'll bring you to the table they don't want you sitting at. I'll open doors you can't kick down alone. But, Naomi, I want your word. My name goes back where it belongs." Naomi extended her hand, a slow smile curving her lips. "Deal." His hand, aged but still firm, clasped hers. No cameras, no ceremony, just an old lion finding an ally with claws sharp enough to join him on his last hunt. Naomi knew this would send the board into a frenzy. They had sidelined Charles for refusing to play their power games. Now he was back with a partner they didn't know how to handle. And not just a partner, a dangerous pair, a man who knew every crack in their armor, and a woman willing to drive the knife in. "Get ready," Naomi said, her voice half warning, half promise. "We're not just taking back your seat, we're dragging the whole table to our side." Charles smiled the rare smile of a man who knew the war had started but, for the first time in years, didn't feel like he was fighting it alone. Naomi understood when an old lion and a queen joined forces. The ones guarding the throne soon feel the ground shifting beneath them. She pulled out a small notebook, her pen gliding quickly across blank pages. Charles sat back, arms crossed, watching her like a veteran observing the next generation prepare for a hunt he no longer had the strength to lead. "The bylaws," Naomi said firmly, "that's Crescent Oak's heartbeat. To tear down their wall, we rewrite them." Charles raised a brow. "What exactly are you planning?" Naomi stopped writing and looked up, her eyes flashing like a blade in the dark. "We change the membership criteria. No more of their unwritten standards used to keep people out. I want to open those gates to people they've never even imagined walking through black entrepreneurs, powerful women, young multicultural families. Crescent Oaks won't be a museum of the past anymore. It'll be the playground of the future." Charles gave a low laugh, half shocked, half thrilled. "You know what that means, don't you? They'll call you a destroyer." "Let them," Naomi shrugged. "Change always starts with the ones they call destroyers." She pulled another sheet and started jotting down names. "I'll bring in new investors, people dying to access spaces Crescent Oaks has kept locked. When money and influence line up, tradition has to step aside. Charles studied her, his expression a mix of pride and caution. You don't just want a seat at their table, you want to redefine the table itself. Naomi nodded. If I only wanted a seat, I'd have left once they opened the gate, but I didn't come here to eat their dinner. I came to change the menu and rewrite the guest list. Charles exhaled slowly. You'll need more than shares. You'll need allies. Naomi smiled. You'll help me get them. I'll get you your seat back. And together, we'll make sure Crescent Oaks stops being their private kingdom. His small nod sealed it. The alliance was forged an old lion with a memory like steel, and a new queen with claws she hadn't even begun to use. Naomi closed her notebook, her voice like steel. It's time they learned these walls weren't built to keep people out. They were built to be broken. And Naomi knew once this plan went public, Crescent Oaks would never be the same. Naomi drove her sleek black sedan down the oak-lined road toward Crescent Oaks. Everything looked the same as that morning: the gleaming bronze plaque, the pristine white walls, the towering iron gate guarding a closed-off world. But this time, the feeling was different. Naomi wasn't here as someone knocking. She was here as someone holding the key. The manager at the guard booth spotted her car from a distance. He recognized the vehicle. He recognized the woman behind the wheel. Naomi caught the brief flicker of unease in his eyes before he smoothed it over. The same man who had coldly told her to turn around now straightened up, lowered his head, and pressed the button to open the gate. The gate creaked open slowly, the metallic groan echoing like a reluctant acceptance. Naomi didn't slow down. She drove past without sparing him a glance, though she could feel the heavy silence there, not an apology, but the bitter quiet of a man forced to bow to the very person he once humiliated. No apology was offered. Naomi didn't need one. She knew an apology here would be nothing but ceremony, never acknowledgement. And sometimes, silence was far more satisfying, silence that forced them to live with the fact that she had entered without their permission. Her car rolled into the grounds. Golfers near the green turned their heads, their eyes no longer merely curious or disdainful. Now, they were tinged with unease. Naomi knew the news had spread. The woman who had been politely escorted out at the gate was now a shareholder with voting rights and the ally of one of the founding members. She parked in front of the main entrance and stepped out deliberately. The tailored suit was the same caliber as before, but today it wasn't just armor, it was a declaration. Naomi climbed the steps, her heels striking the stone in a rhythm that announced she wasn't here to ask for a seat. She was here to take one. An attendant hurried over to open the door, bowing slightly. Naomi gave a faint nod, no smile. She didn't need to play the gracious guest. She walked in as though this place had always belonged to her. Inside, the setting was as familiar as it was audacious oil portraits of the founding members. A deep burgundy carpet that stretched like a banner of ownership, the kind of ownership they believed only belonged to them. Naomi paused for a moment, scanning the room, then let a small, private smile form on her lips. This time, no one dared ask if she belonged here. But soon, they'd be asking something else: did they still belong? Now that the board had shifted hands, the air inside Crescent Oaks froze as Naomi walked through the massive wooden doors. The hum of conversation at the bar softened to murmurs, then fell silent. She didn't need to look to know that every eye was tracking her every move. The members, most of them immortalized in the photos lining the halls, clustered in small groups. Some stared at her as if she'd just violated an unspoken law. Their expressions caught between anger and confusion. They had heard about Naomi's purchase, heard about the meeting, and now they were watching the woman who had once been kept out walk-in like she'd never been denied. A gray-haired man in golf attire muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Times really have changed. Now anyone with money can walk in." Naomi stopped, turning her head toward him. Her smile wasn't polite, it was a reminder. "You're right. And I am living proof. The man dropped his gaze, quickly turning away as if to swallow his words. Not every look carried contempt. In the corner, an older woman gave Naomi a subtle nod, just enough to signal acknowledgement. A younger member, likely a recently admitted entrepreneur, watched her with open curiosity, maybe even admiration. Naomi understood every pair of eyes in this room was a piece on the board, and some of those pieces were already willing to switch sides. Naomi said nothing. She let the silence work for her, no explanations, no justifications. She simply crossed the lobby, slow and deliberate, as if this path had been built for her alone. The portraits on the wall, all those pale, self-satisfied faces of the founders now seemed to watch her as she moved. Naomi stopped in front of the largest one at the end of the hall, a man in a classic suit, wearing a smug half-smile. It had been hung as a symbol of permanence, but now Naomi regarded it as a challenge. "Interesting," she murmured, softly enough for herself, but loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "Your tradition's going to have to make room now." She continued up the stairs toward the boardroom. Each step sounded like a drumbeat, signaling to everyone watching that the rhythm of Crescent Oaks was no longer theirs to control. And Naomi knew when someone once excluded walks in as if she owns the place. Everyone else is forced to wonder how long before they're the ones on the outside. At the landing to the grand hall, Naomi stopped for a moment and drew a deep breath. The air here smelled familiar polished wood, aged wine, and the staleness of power left unchallenged for too long. This time, she wasn't walking in as a guest. She was walking in to leave a mark they couldn't erase. In the corner, a group of members watched quietly. One man, Charles's age but without his steel, shook his head. "She's going to ruin everything this place used to stand for," he muttered to his companion. Naomi didn't turn, but she heard every word. She kept walking, her heels hitting the stone in a steady rhythm. "I am here, and I'm not going anywhere." At the center of the hall, Naomi paused in front of the founder's plaque, a wall of engraved names. All of them shared one thing in common. None of them looked like her. Naomi ran her fingers along the cold surface as if she were reading an old chapter of a book. "Every era has people who thought they'd last forever," she whispered, just for herself. A young attendant, nervous but curious, approached. "Ms. Carter, would you like me to escort you to the boardroom?" Naomi smiled faintly. "No need. I know the way." A simple reply, but it made him pause. She knew the way because Naomi was no longer the outsider searching for a seat. She was part of the power structure now. As she climbed the final steps, Naomi thought back to those childhood days, standing outside the fence, peering in. Back then, she believed power was simply crossing the gate. Now, she understood real power was making them open the gate because they knew without you, their game couldn't go on. At the boardroom door, Naomi paused, catching her reflection in the glass. Not to fix her appearance, but to look at the woman who had turned humiliation into leverage. Then she pushed the door open without knocking. Every conversation inside stopped dead. Naomi didn't need an introduction. Her presence alone said everything. The story of Crescent Oaks had a new main character, and it was her. But Naomi knew walking in was one thing. Keeping her seat at the table was the real fight. And that fight started now. The press room was packed. Camera flashes went off in rapid bursts, the clatter of keyboards mixing with a barrage of questions. Naomi sat at the long table between Charles and Garrison, but every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her. A reporter stood up, his voice loud and clear, dripping with condescension's Carter. "What do you think about the traditions of Crescent Oaks? Some say you don't understand them and that you're trying to destroy them." The question hung in the air like an arrow aimed straight at her. A few people in the back chuckled softly, clearly expecting Naomi to get defensive, to explain herself, or dodge. She did none of those things. Naomi set her pen down, lifted her head, and locked eyes with the reporter so calm it made the room fall silent. Tradition, Naomi repeated slowly, savoring the word as if tasting it. Interesting. It's the word people use when they want to keep things exactly as they are, when they want to protect something not because it's good, but because it's convenient for them. A few murmurs rippled across the room. Naomi continued, her voice clearer, stronger. I respect tradition. But I don't respect traditions that exist only to slam doors in the faces of people who don't look like the ones who built them. If Crescent Oaks truly stands for something meaningful, it has to be strong enough to open its doors, to change, and to survive in a new world. Another reporter cut in, "So you're saying Crescent Oaks will completely change?" Naomi leaned toward the microphone, the hint of a smile playing at her lips. "I'm saying Crescent Oaks will continue to live. But it will no longer be a private playground for a select few who think they get to decide who belongs. It will become a symbol of inclusion where value is defined not by skin color or lineage, but by contribution and character." Charles glanced at Naomi, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, subtle, almost imperceptible. He knew she had just done what few dared, turned a loaded question into a statement of power. Naomi lowered the mic and let the silence stretch for a few seconds, long enough for her words to sink in. "And," she said, her voice dropping lower, "if anyone feels threatened by that, then maybe it's time they ask themselves, are they protecting tradition or protecting privilege?" The room fell silent. No one dared to interrupt. Naomi had just reclaimed the word tradition and turned it into her weapon. But the press conference wasn't over. Naomi still had one final move, one that would ensure her name would be remembered. A young reporter in the front row, perhaps the only one not trying to mask their admiration, raised a hand. "Ms. Carter. Then what do you think tradition really should be?" Naomi leaned forward toward the mic, smiling not the polite kind, but the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Tradition," she said, voice steady and resonant, "isn't about closing the door on others. Tradition is when everyone, no matter their skin color or background, can sit at the same table. And together, redefine what's worth passing on to the next generation." The room seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just an answer. It was a direct strike at the idea that Crescent Oaks was untouchable. Naomi continued, "If a tradition only serves a select few while treating everyone else as outsiders, then it's not a legacy, it's a gilded cage. And I don't believe Crescent Oaks was built to be a cage. I believe it can be a place where people come together to create something bigger than themselves." Another reporter shot in, voice sharp, "But some say you're commercializing this tradition, turning it into a tool for personal gain." Naomi raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Commercializing. That's a convenient way to describe anyone who dares to change something. But let me ask you this: if we expand opportunity, if we create space for those once excluded and they're willing to contribute, is that commercialization or is that evolution?" A few people in the back nodded. The question didn't need an answer. Naomi had framed it as a mirror, forcing her critics to look at themselves. Naomi swept her gaze across the room, letting it linger on each face. "I'm not here to ask for permission to belong," she said, each word hitting with precision. "I'm here to make sure Crescent Oaks belongs to everyone willing to contribute to its legacy. And if that makes some people feel threatened, maybe they need to ask themselves, are they protecting tradition or just protecting their privilege?" The air felt sucked out of the room. Naomi let the silence hang long enough to turn her words into something no one could ignore. Then she straightened in her chair and closed her statement with a line that made every head snap toward her. "If this tradition doesn't have room for all of us, then it isn't worth keeping." Camera flashes erupted again. Naomi hadn't just answered a question, she had redefined the entire conversation. But no one in the room knew she still had one last statement that would make sure Crescent Oaks would never forget her name. Naomi stood. The sound of her chair scraping the wooden floor cut through the silence like a warning bell. Every head turned toward her. Cameras clicked wildly. But Naomi didn't rush. She stepped away from the table, walking toward the podium at the center of the room. The room went still. Not the silence of respect, but the heavy silence of people realizing they had just lost control. Not the silence of noisy victory either. It was the silence of exposed truths and masks ripped away. Naomi placed both hands on the podium, looking directly at the faces before her. In the front row sat Bennett, the man who led the smear campaign, stiff and tight-lipped. Charles tilted his head slightly, his eyes glowing with quiet satisfaction. The reporters stayed poised with their cameras, but Naomi made them wait. "The day I was stopped at the gates of Crescent Oaks," Naomi began, her voice calm but commanding. "I realized this place wasn't just a club. It was a symbol of a closed world, where a few people believed they had the right to define everyone else's worth." She paused, letting the weight of each word fill the air. "But today, I stand here not because they opened the door for me, but because I found my way through it. And I won't just stand inside. I will change how that door opens for those who come after me." A low murmur rose at the back of the room, but Naomi didn't care. Some may say I'm destroying tradition, but the truth is I'm doing what tradition never had the courage to do, making it something no one can own exclusively. Naomi stepped back, letting her eyes sweep the room. "If anyone here feels threatened, remember this: I didn't take your seat. You built too many walls and forgot how to share the table." Then she stepped away from the podium and started toward the door. No applause, no shouts, just silence. But Naomi knew this wasn't indifference. It was the silence of people who'd just been exposed and of an old order cracking right in front of them. At the door, Naomi turned back once, briefly. The battle was over, but the real game, the one where she wrote the rules, had only just begun. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.